Okay, well, welcome everybody to what is the 13th of the National HAB Observing Network Community Practice webinars. This one is on emergency response, the West Coast PSP case study. And we think this one is particularly pertinent because it shows the value of having observations and what happens when you don't have observations. And we hope that this, well, can I have the next slide, Masha? On the call are Dr. Clarissa Anderson and myself. We're the co-chairs of the National HAB Observing Network. And I will introduce the speakers in a few minutes. So could you go on to the next slide, Masha? So many of you have seen this slide many times before, but this is just to remind everybody what NHABON is. And it's something we are working towards, which would be a sustained national network for regional HAB observing. And so this is a particular case of regional HAB observing. And the idea is that it would provide sustained observations for HAB detection, early warning, and forecasting. And this one is a particularly good case of the need for early warning. Can I have the next slide, Masha? I don't want to spend too much time on these slides because we're going to get to the speakers. So here is a diagram of what we think is involved with in any situation where you have observations that then lead to data integration. Normally they would lead to modeling and prediction and synthesized products, but in this case, the whole circle was quite short-circuited and went from data integration to societal needs immediately. And that, of course, is making us think about some more what we need in the way of HAB observations. But some sort of process like this would be taking place in any of the nodes for a national HAB observing network. And these would, in theory, work together, the regional nodes towards a national network. So could I have the next slide? So here are our three speakers, and I don't think any of them really need an introduction. They were the people on the ground dealing with this particular event when it happened, and I will let them describe it to you because they can do it far better than I can. So I can't remember who we decided would go first. Was it Matt?
Yes,
yeah,
I think
Matt.
these are in order of appearance, Quay.
Oh, yes, okay. And then Jerry and then Zach.
Do you have their bios?
No, do you?
Yes, I do. I'm happy to read them out since we have
Sorry.
some exciting lineup. I'll go ahead and do it, Quay.
Yeah, you're gonna have to.
Yeah, so Matt Hunter, many of you know, he's worked as a coastal shellfish manager for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife since 2001. And there his primary responsibilities are the razor clam resource in fisheries, as well as federally funded phytoplankton monitoring program. And then we'll hear from Jerry Borchert. He's the marine biotoxin lead at the Washington State Department of Health Marine Biotoxin Program. He's responsible for managing the Sentinel Mussel Analysis Program, conducting recreational and commercial shellfish closure recalls during HABs, and then also providing technical assistance to shellfish growers, tribal and local health jurisdictions, and support for the arsenic testing program for the Washington gooey duck fisheries and PFAS monitoring of shellfish. So quite a lot of things. And then Zach Forster is a coastal shellfish biologist with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, working out of Willapa Bay Field Station in Southwest Washington. So yeah, excited to have the three of them talking about PSP today. I think we can just go straight to Matt now.
Okay, do we see the screen yet?
Yes.
Yep.
All right. All right. Well, thank you for the introduction and good afternoon. My name is Matt Hunter and I am the Shellfish Project Leader with the Oregon Department Marine Resource Program. And I'm going to present to you today kind of the overview of what happened to the Oregon shellfish fisheries in 2024 from this unprecedented shellfish poisoning event that we had.
You need to plug your computer in.
Well, mine's plugged in, so I don't understand what's going on. So,
Outage.
So if we lose power, I guess we lose power, but I'm not seeing that anywhere on mine. So, let's just go with it and see if it works. So I have a lot of info to cover, but I want to give a brief background on the Oregon shellfish fisheries, biotoxins that impact those fisheries, as well as monitoring of those biotoxins. Then I'll dive right into the event of the PSP event, and then kind of some lessons learned as well as potential recommendations. So Oregon has a long history of commercial and recreational shellfish harvesting. This is incredibly important to coastal communities in the state in general. Many of these coastal communities are marginalized. And so annually, there's about 200,000 recreational shellfish licenses sold. And most of those licenses, people harvest crab, clams, and mussels, but there's a myriad of other species that are included in this license as well. For commercial shellfish fisheries, these are incredibly important to the coastal communities, specifically the commercial Dungeness crab fishery, which we consider a keystone economic fishery, counts for over 90 million to the fishing fleet. Wild bivalve commercial harvest is another one. These are worth about $1 million to the participants. And then mariculture, which is almost exclusively oysters, accounts for about $20 million of sales annually. So in Oregon, we have two naturally occurring biotoxins that impact marine shellfish. Domoic acid, which is produced by diatom, impacts our bivalves, and then through trophic transfer impacts Dungeness crab. Paralytic shellfish toxins are produced by a dinoflagellate and impact bivalves, but in Oregon, we don't have any record of trophic transfer into crab of PSP. So our PSP blooms, they're highly cyclical and variable in both intensity, frequency, and duration. And in many years, we have no closures at all. But when we do have closures, it seems like mussels account for about 85% or more of those closures. In contrast, domoic acid is much more frequent, especially after the marine heat wave that occurred between 2014 and 2017. And since then, there's been at least one Oregon beachside harvest area closed 95% of the time. This biotoxin primarily impacts razor clams, where over 95% of the closures are related strictly to razor clams. Due to species deprivation variances, you can see that DA closures are much longer than paralytic shellfish poison closures. Since mussels can deprivate the toxin regardless of the load much faster than razor clams within days to weeks, and razor clams can take weeks to months if the toxin is high enough, the life of the animal. In Oregon, the Department of Agriculture is responsible for the tissue testing of shellfish in the state of Oregon. And like other Pacific Coast states, they follow federal guidelines on testing protocols, and all labs are certified to meet certain criteria. DA is analyzed through HPLC and is a relatively quick method compared to PST, which is analyzed in Oregon through a bioassay. As expected, intertidal
So it looks like you may have lost power for Matt.
Wow.
So we may pause, switch to the next speaker and see if we can get back on. What do you think, Clarissa?
Yes, I think we yeah.
Carrie, that would mean that you're up. Are you good to go?
Pick up where he left off.
Are you muted?
Nope, now you can hear me, right?
Yep.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Mhm.
And can you see my presentation?
Not yet.
No, we can't.
Not yet. Oh,
Now you can. You got it?
Yep.
Okay.
yep.
Well, I'm Jerry
Now we
Borchert. Okay, a lot of information to cover here too, like Matt said, talking about the Washington State perspective of what happened last year with this coastal event. So things we'll talk about here, this was a very unusual event and how fast and rapid it was when it impacted the coast. Some good news, really good news, we had no official illnesses from Washington residents harvesting shellfish in Washington or purchasing commercially harvested shellfish in Washington. Unfortunately, there were 2 Washington residents that were in Oregon that harvested shellfish in Oregon that were part of the folks who had PSP. Good news on that, they're fine now, so all is good on both of those fronts. Some things to talk about, lessons learned. Lab capacity was a big deal for us getting through this event, and I'll talk quite a bit more about that in a bit. Poison control, reestablishing connections to have a better flow of information for that in future events. And also this was unusual in that it has a different uptake dynamics, and I'll mention something more about that in a bit. Next steps, cyst mapping, early warning to help us understand is this a likelihood to happen again, and that's going to be coming up soon to talk about here. And sentinel mussel sites, we're going to be adding more mussel sites to our coastal bays. And we're also modifying our coastal bay management plan because of what happened last year, kind of updating it. And we're always working on press release language. We work with all our stakeholders, the local health industry, the commercial farmers, the tribes, the other state agencies to try to get it right, because it's so important to get this information correct and out quickly when there's so much going on all at once. So these next slides are going to kind of give the timeline in Washington State, what we experienced last year. And to get things in perspective, this slide, the map on the far right is the Washington coastline and Oregon coastline. And those circles are the level of PSP toxin we were getting in shellfish samples. And that inset map there is the blow up of our coastal bays, Gray Harbor to the north with the 2 red dots you see there, and Willapa Bay to the south. So going back last year, not too far, but a year ago from now, April 18th, our mussels, our sentinel mussels were NTD, no toxin detected. That's great news. Jump ahead to April 29th, we started seeing low levels of PSP moving into Grays Harbor. And then May 17th, we start seeing, Oregon is starting to get PSP. Jumping ahead to the 23rd of May, now we go into emergency sampling in Grays Harbor. And what that means is that our sentinel mussels are typically tested every 2 weeks unless we see toxins, especially toxins on the increase. And then we go weekly or sometimes even 2 to 3 days, depending on the event. So we ramped up our sampling at this time. And our neighbors to the north, Seal Rock to Cape Mears, Oregon was closed. And those 2 red dots you see in that insert there, that's Grays Harbor to the north. Our sentinel site is inside Grays Harbor, it's the dot on the right. And that is our sentinel site for many decades. That's what we act on for commercial and recreational testing and harvesting protocols. But because we were getting such large cell count information from our early warning phytoplankton monitoring, or have the Olympic region harmful algal bloom group, massive amounts of Alexandrium cells were being detected. We thought we better check the jetty mussels because that is on the outpost side part of things. And I also mentioned here in Washington, our coastal beaches are closed to the sport harvest year round because we just don't have enough monitoring to go on to make sure it's safe to harvest shellfish on our coastal beaches, except for razor clams. But in this case, these beaches were closed already on the coast, but the mussels from the jetty were 383, well over the action level of 80. Down in Oregon, Lincoln City had 148. Jump ahead to the 24th of May. Now we have a sport closure inside Grays Harbor for all species of shellfish, but still commercial is testing. But we notify the commercial industry at these times, if you're harvesting or intend to be harvesting, we need to be testing your product right away. So the 24th, our sentinel site, the mussels, that's that red dot on the right in that Grays Harbor map there, 389, very similar to what was on the outside of the jetty. So these cells are coming into Grays Harbor at this time. Our first commercial sample, that's that South Bay oysters inside Grays Harbor, was 40. No commercial closure yet, only a sport closure. Oysters were 40, not at the action level for 80. Moving ahead here, moving to the 26th, Oregon is now reporting PSP illnesses down in Oregon. Washington to border to Oregon through Cape Mears is closed, so that closure is expanding. 27th, we now have emergency Willapa sampling because we're seeing toxins showing up in our sentinel sites, our mussel sites in Willapa Bay. And this is when we notify too, the next day, the 28th, we have a sport closure in Willapa Bay that we're notifying the growers you need to send samples in. And I want to point out, these coastal bays are very rural. They're quite a far away, a bit of a drive from our public health lab in Seattle. In fact, when industry sometimes puts samples on overnight and pays premium charges for FedEx and UPS, it still may take 2 to 3 days to get to our lab. So in some of these cases, some of the growers will drive samples to the lab and spend a day getting there and getting back just to make things happen quicker. So we did notify everybody about, if you're harvesting, you had to send samples in on the 28th. 2 days later, the 30th, we have our first commercial closures and recalls. 3 growing areas in Willapa Bay, that's the bay to the south, Bay Center, Bruceport, Stony Point, close with recalls. And another day later, the 31st, we have Nakata, very large growing area, also part of the recall in Willapa Bay. So very fast moving, impacted quite a bit of areas in this Willapa Bay, coastal bay. And this next slide, it just kind of bounces between the two. I'll go back and forth. Going to the first week of June, you can see how this PSP toxin was really surging and ramping up quickly in our mussel monitoring along our Olympic Peninsula, all the way up to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the entrance into Puget Sound. Next slide. So what do we do? A lot of news releases went out. A lot of information is flowing every which way. We met with the shellfish industry, the tribes, everybody that was being impacted by this. We still put signs up everywhere, including the coastal beaches, which were already closed, because sometimes people ignore those closures. So we wanted to make sure that there were signs up there if they weren't hearing the news, at marinas, at beach approaches to the dunes. Everywhere we could, we put signs up. We also directed a lot of people to our shellfish safety map to get the latest information for where beaches are, what the current status of closures were at. A lot of folks go to this website. It's heavily used. So now a little bit more in perspective about the unusual nature of this bloom. So this graph here shows closures on our coastal bays. And we have some circles and triangles. The circles are our mussel sites and they're color coded for Grays Harbor and Willapa Bay. And the triangles are commercial samples. Those are oysters. And the last time we had a commercial closure on our coastal bays was back in the fall of 1997. So that's quite a while ago. And we, as you can also see, in the years since 1997, we've had quite a few mussels, our sentinel mussels, go over the action level, that red dotted line there, which is at 80 micrograms per 100 grams of shellfish tissue. Quite a few sport or recreational closures, but commercial samples have always been below that action level until last year in spring when we had this big coastal PSP event. So very unusual. They're far and few between. Hopefully it stays that way. Perfect storm for testing here. This is what took a lot of time on our part here in the biotoxin program. So it's springtime. In springtime, we start seeing a lot of PSP showing up in Puget Sound. That's where we typically have a lot of closures every year, not so much on the coast. We test samples of shellfish with the mouse bioassay, and we use mice for this. That's why it's called the mouse bioassay. So we were ramping up anyway, and typically this time of year in spring, we can test between 10 or actually between 20 to 30 shellfish samples a day, Monday through Friday. And if we have big bloom events, that sample load can increase. So there was a shortage of mice. There was a demand for mice. We don't have a mouse colony for this type of analysis. We purchase our mice through a provider in California, as do the other states on the West Coast. Oregon needed a lot of mice. We did because of what was happening, so that we were running out of mice. So we went into priority testing because this was such an unusual event. So many samples were slamming our lab every day. I got authorization for lab staff to get overtime, to work extra long days, to process these samples and kick out results, also to work weekends. Working with the shellfish industry, this worked out really well. They communicated among themselves as we started seeing the levels of toxin drop. We were able to have them work together and pick out certain locations in Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor where they wanted to maybe get areas reopened, as we saw that the cell counts were dropping and our mussels were showing a decrease in toxin. And they worked together to different farmers to have a driver drive a whole bunch of samples representing different companies up to the lab. And I had the lab staff say, if we get samples at 7 a.m., we'll get results out by noon to try to turn things around to reduce this economic hit that impacted this rural area for all the shellfish farmers. We also had another huge batch of results that were coming around 7 o'clock at night during this event. We also postponed some PSP testing in Puget Sound based on the history of risk, and also where we had sound toxins, phytoplankton, early warning monitoring. And what we did there is, because we were running low on mice, if this area was considered low risk and we had good real occurring data showing there was no HAB cells present in Puget Sound, we postponed running samples a few days so we could focus on getting these commercial samples tested. And finally, the mouse bioassay, you need 3 mice per sample to report a full value. And because we were so short on mice, I had the lab screen all samples with 1 mouse. And if there was toxin there, and it was a commercial sample in particular from the coast in this case, I had them dial it in with all 3 mice to get a whole value, but it provided more mice to screen more samples so we could effectively close areas down if we saw other areas showing toxin. And this next slide here just shows where our sentinel sites are at. Those are little mussel shells. A lot of sites, about 100 to 120 sites at any year that we test every 2 weeks or more frequently weekly if we see toxin. We're adding more mussel sites now to those coastal bays of Grays Harbor and Willapa Bay because of what happened last year, and we're in the process of setting that up as we speak. Another thing unusual about this bloom is the uptake. So usually our sentinel mussels work really well for us as the worst case scenario, the canary in the coal mine. If our mussels show toxin, usually we have a 1 to 2 week lead time before commercial species, that being oysters and clams, start showing toxin, getting close to or exceeding that action level. It works really well for us for many, many decades, which is why we are so happy with the Sentinel program until last year. Last year, when our mussels went hot and we started testing commercial samples when they were notified to send samples in, the commercial samples were equal to or slightly more toxic than the mussels. Extremely unusual. I've only seen this happen once before in over 20 years in Puget Sound. So again, this made another thing unique about this whole bloom event. So testing, that was a big bottleneck for getting results turned around and to open areas up and to keep track of everything. Our lab did get approved to get some emergency funding to look at receptor binding assay as a potentially new method to replace the mouse bioassay. And we're working quickly on this to potentially use it, working with the Food and Drug Administration, hopefully to screen samples with it as we get more QA/QC done with it, to reduce the providing a sampling of mice, using mice for the mouse bioassay. If we can screen more samples and do emergency closures, we can reopen with the mouse bioassay. So that's something we're still working out, more to come on that. Also working with the Olympic Region Harmful Algal Bloom Group, or NHABON, our early warning partners on the coast that does phytoplankton monitoring. They're looking at new screening tools, not for Department of Health to use for regulatory purposes, but for the shellfish industry, potentially to screen their own samples if we get into another event like this, to more fine-tune how many samples come to the lab where areas may show less toxin. We can confirm that at the lab and say yes or no about harvesting. Anyway, it's just more about prioritization at the commercial side to determine which samples they may send to the lab. Lastly, I'm going to talk about cyst surveys. So real quick history here. Back in 2014, we had a PSP event that happened in Puget Sound in the fall, and this happened when the blob, this big pool of warm water in the Pacific, came into Washington, and we had a PSP event where you see that circle there, and part of Hood Canal called Quilcene Day Bob in the fall, and that area had never had a biotoxin closure before. It was really unusual, and really high levels of PSP showed up, and it generated a lot of questions from the industry and tribes. So I reached out to some partners in Washington State at NOAA and University of Washington and others, saying, hey, I wish we could do a cyst survey to see if any cysts were laid down in this fall event in 2014. Sure enough, we did get funding for it. We did find out there was a lot of cysts, and it prepared us for another major PSP event that happened in the same area in 2015 in the spring. And that time we had a commercial closures, but no recall because we were ready for it. So based on the success of that cyst survey, Washington had reached out again, working with the National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science and Harmful Algal Bloom Event Response Program, got additional funding this year to do cyst surveys for both Grays Harbor and Willapa Bay. And these maps here will show the little yellow dots where we did collect sediment samples. And hopefully we'll have results in about a month. And with those results, will let us know, are we at an elevated risk of a repeat occurrence of this event here this year here in Washington. And that's all I have. Thank you. Any questions? And Matt's back.
We'll take that to the end, Jerry. So we're going to push all the questions to the end per tradition. And so that was fantastic. And it looks like we have Matt back, despite your catastrophic failures in the office there.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. Sorry about that.
That's
So you
okay.
wanna pick up?
We'd love to pick up where you left off.
Where was that? Was it when I was swearing at my computer? Did you guys get that?
I think you're about 3, maybe 4 slides in, probably 3 is my
Okay.
memory.
Let me know when you see it.
I will. And we have, yeah, there we go.
Yep, there you go.
There we go. All right. So let's see. We won't do that one. We won't do that one. I
This is
think
where-
we're.
I think
Were
we
we
were,
on?
oh, we were here. We were here.
We were here. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were. So I'll just repeat the whole thing. So in contrast to domoic acid, is much more frequent, and especially after the marine heat wave in 2014, 2017. And since then, there's been at least one beach closure in Oregon 95% of the time. Almost all of these are razor clam closures, and DA closures, you can see in the graph, are much longer than our PSP closures, and that has to do with just species deparation differences. Whereas mussels, even if both species have the same toxin load, mussels are going to deprecate it much faster than razor clams. And mussels days to weeks, where razor clams can be months to even the life of the animal. So the Oregon Department of Agriculture is responsible for the tissue testing in the state of Oregon, and like other Pacific Northwest states, they follow federal guidelines on testing protocols, and all labs are certified to meet specific criteria. DA is analyzed with HPLC. It's quicker method than PST, which we use bioassay. As expected, intertidal shellfish are collected during low tides. Those in Oregon and the Pacific West Coast happen twice a month, and during that time, depending on weather and tides, either 10 or 15 sites are sampled, and this is primarily with mussels, razor clams, and bay clams in that order. So, and then Dungeness crab is only sampled if razor clams in the adjacent beach areas are above the alert level, and then they try to get those samples on off weeks for the of the bivalves. So, since 2005, I've been very fortunate to have received several federal funding grants for the phytoplankton monitoring project here in Oregon. And the goal of this project is to track species composition and abundance, specifically for harmful algal bloom species along the surf zone. We sample 8, sometimes more sites along the coast. These are picked in areas where we have shellfish harvest, but also where we have our standard ODA tissue testing. And these samples are whole water samples. We use light microscopy to analyze the samples for harmful algal bloom species. And if we need to analyze for toxin production, we have ELISA capability in my lab. And all this data is used to validate forecast models. And specifically, it goes into our Pacific Northwest Harmful Algal Bloom Bulletin. This is what coastal managers use to provide an early warning of potential biotoxin issues. And you can see in the red box, this is the Oregon data compared to the box to the left of it, which would be the Washington data. So let's just dive right into the 2024 paralytic shellfish poisoning event. So since you all know what the Oregon shell fisheries are, you can kind of figure out what's going to happen. So in Oregon on Memorial Day weekend, the Oregon Poison Control alerted the Oregon Health Authority that they had several cases of PSP from individuals who had harvested mussels in the central coast of Oregon. 7 individuals had been admitted to local hospitals, all symptomatic of PSP with varying symptoms, everything up to being intubated. This is an extremely rare event, and as you can see from this graph, this is the first one that we've had in several years, but actually in decades, that have been from wild harvest shellfish. Due to this, the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Oregon Department of Agriculture immediately began closing mussel harvest in the impacted area. Staff collected emergency samples from other species in the area, and then there was a large-scale multi-agency media blitz that went out to alert harvesters about the closures and with the illnesses. And as we continued to get results, they all pretty much had levels of PST, and many were very high. Many were well above the closure threshold, and some were at levels that we had never seen before. And this increased the closure areas and species impacted. By the first part of June, all mussel harvest and all bay clam harvest were closed coastwide, and oyster sales were closed in 3 of our bigger bays for productivity. Only razor clams were not impacted coastwide, but they did have the southern half of the state closed. This happened during peak low tide series, and it happened during where we were having our free fishing and shell fishing weekend with planned clinics. So these were all impacted by our closures. Just for reference, most of our harvest happens in the spring and summer months. So this was a very inopportune time, not that any time is, to have a closure when you can expect thousands upon thousands of people on any low tide series. During this event, the Oregon Health Authority released a questionnaire that was sent to all ODF&W license holders, as well as being pushed out by all agencies' social media and websites. They received over 1,200 responses of case characteristic data, and from the hospital data, the poison control data, and the questionnaire data, it was determined that there were 42 presumptive cases of PSP. 40 of these were from Oregon residents, 2 of them were from Washington residents, and 85% of those occurred over the holiday weekend, even though the time period was longer than that. Mussels were the primary harvest, or the primary species that was harvested that caused paralytic shellfish poisoning, followed by bay clams and then oysters. As you can see, no crab were involved in any of the presumptive cases. Most of the harvest came from Tillamook County, which was in the kind of the north central part of Oregon, and most of the harvesters lived out of county, so they lived in more of the populated areas in the Willamette Valley. What made this event unprecedented in Oregon was how rapid and intense the accumulation was. Mussels exceeded the closure threshold incredibly fast. In less than 5 days, they exceeded the closure threshold by a factor of 68. The red line in this graph shows you where the closure level is, and you can see that these are incredibly high levels, and it was incredibly fast. Bay clam accumulations were also very high, and mostly in the Tillamook County beaches, or sorry, bays. They exceeded the previous high by almost threefold. And then mariculture oyster products were also very high, but it was unique that it was in one north estuary and one central estuary that had the issues. And levels were substantially higher than we had ever seen before. Razor clams were the only species where it wasn't across the board impacted. While Coos County razors were very high, they did not surpass our previous high levels. And north of there, the levels in those razor clams were very low, not even to the closure threshold. And this was probably due to the fact that at that time, the razor clams were spawning in that area. And when they spawn, they typically don't feed. So if you're not feeding, you're not going to get accumulation of toxins. Deparation rates varied, and since deparation is dependent on species and also exposure and toxin levels, you can kind of expect from what I told you before that since razors didn't have a very high accumulation, they would be the first to open, which they were. Oysters, ironically, were a little bit differently. Since they had the second highest accumulation, they became the second to open up, and then bay clams followed, and then, of course, mussels that had the highest accumulation were the last to open. By the beginning of August, all species had levels below the closure. What was interesting is that this, even though we had opened up, these were incremental openings, there was significant economic loss during the closures, but there was economic loss even when all these areas were open because harvesters had a loss of confidence that it was safe to harvest shellfish. So there's a very slow recovery for those individuals to gain the confidence to go back out and harvest. What lessons did we learn? Well, first off, our surf zone phytoplankton data is drastically needed, and I can't highlight this enough. Unfortunately, ODF&W was between staffing and due to an untimely position vacancy. While Washington did have sampling on the south coast of Washington, they did detect incredibly high levels of the dinoflagellate, which enacted immediate closures on all of their coastwide shellfish harvesting bays, including in their beaches. They didn't open up again until they tested below the threshold. This is completely in contrast for what Oregon did, where we had these micro closures, where we're much more reactive in our approach. And this likely led to more people being impacted by the event. While we did get some phytoplankton data from our collaborators with Oregon State University, who were able to go out and get nearshore water samples from the central coast, this was all reactive. This was after the event had already occurred. The offshore samples that you can see in this graph show that there definitely was Alexandrium off the coast. And while this was incredibly important data, it was, like I said, reactive and after it started, but it showed that the bloom persisted even after the illnesses had occurred. The other lesson we learned is that our Oregon Department of Agriculture biotoxin capacity, or their lab capacity, is very limited. And when we had the need for more samples to be analyzed, it overtaxed the lab's capacities. and they were not able to analyze all the samples or even run them at full dilutions. There were issues getting the biologicals that were needed for the bioassay due to the increased demand by not only Oregon, but other states. ODFW had to rely on our Washington counterparts to test leftover samples from individuals that had been symptomatic. So during future events, I think that the increased capacity and alternative analysis options would better serve to provide effective public safety. And then lastly, for our lessons learned, our closure messaging was pretty much fell short. Harvesters didn't know about the closures. The signs were lacking or too small or obstructed. The rapid closures made it incredibly difficult to keep up with signage. There were incredible language barriers. There were electronic deserts. People would see the sign, but most of the coast doesn't have cell phone service. And even if it did have cell phone service, most individuals, or a lot of individuals, don't have smartphones or social media, so they wouldn't have even known that we pushed out media blitzes. There was lots of confusion on the incremental closures and also on the incremental openings. People just didn't know what was open and what was closed. And there was lots of misinformation. And all of this led to a confidence loss in consumer shellfish safety. So recommendations. Seasonal mussel closure. I think this is probably the biggest one that we can see as a state agency. Mussels just accumulate way too fast for really any testing method. Our current methods are time consuming and they tax lab capacities. Our signage is an issue. We can't get the signs up fast enough. There's a language barrier that proved to be much bigger than what was anticipated. Both Oregon and Washington have seasonal annual mussel closures due to mostly for these reasons. And Oregon could do the same. As you can see from this graph, that we do have periods of the year where we have more closures than we would on other years. So agency resource managers also need to look at proactive solutions for early warning capabilities. One of them that we're looking for is the solid phase absorption toxin testing. This would be a sentinel method to detect toxins, specifically in estuaries. We're going to look at industry collaboration for this. We can also collaborate with researchers using spectral analysis to determine if HABs are present along the coastal nearshore, and then ELISA analysis for PST, which would make our HAB monitoring very similar to what we do for domoic acid, where it's a very effective early warning tool. And then also I think that more offshore observing systems off Oregon would be very beneficial. Knowing where these blooms are coming from, if they're coming from offshore or nearshore, would be incredibly helpful to resource managers. And then there's a lot of forthcoming technology would be very helpful for us. But overall, I think that the improved interagency communication and collaboration would be paramount. And that would be really effective for public science communication. And that is the extent of my talk.
Excellent. We're glad we got you back. Continue to post your questions in the question part of the chat window, and we will move on to Zach.
Okay, is everyone seeing the presentation there?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, good. So yeah, I'm just going to wrap up by talking a little bit about local impacts to Willapa Bay area and some of our phytoplankton monitoring data that we collected during this event. So just real quick, a snapshot of cell counts here. On the left, these are cell counts from the end of May, beginning of June, collected by the Olympic region harmful algal bloom monitoring network and partners up and down the coast. And as you can see, this bloom was a large bloom and resulted in the highest cell counts of Alexandrium that we've recorded since the monitoring program began in 2000. So 187,000 cells a liter of Alexandrium on Copalis Beach, 35,000 cells a liter down on Long Beach. So a pretty good spread up and down the coast. Jerry pointed this out, so I'm not going to touch on it too much, but unlike Oregon, Washington coast is closed unless open for testing, except for the aquaculture industry and recreational harvest in Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor. So the shellfish industry in Willapa Bay is a major economic driver in Pacific County down on the Southwest Washington coast, it equates for about 25% of the total labor income in the county. So any closures or disruptions to the aquaculture industry and shell fishing have really large, widespread impacts to these rural economies. It's also important to the state and really to the nation. Just in Willapa Bay, we produce about 25% of all of the nation's oysters. So needless to say, this closure was a pretty big deal. After the closure, the Willapa Bay Grace Harbor Oyster Growers Association sent out a survey to local growers in Willapa Bay and Grace Harbor, asking about economic impacts and future needs. And out of that survey was identified about a $1 million direct loss to farms. So this was from initial product recall, economic loss due to reduced wages, and then also just a big loss in sales. So market confidence, like Matt mentioned, there was a number of articles that came out around the time of the closure to get the news out to protect human health, but those articles kept getting picked up for, in some case, 2 months afterwards. And I think it really confused consumers and sent some mixed messaging. I will note that there was a lot of great articles that came out describing the event afterwards that helped try to educate people. And so I think moving forward, we need to probably place more emphasis on following up with articles of that nature. So this event also impacted wild stock shellfish fisheries. We did close commercial razor clams as a precautionary closure on the Willapa Spits. This was a closure that happened during peak season. There was about a 3-week loss of work during that time. And then also recreational bay clams and oysters in Willapa Bay and Grace Harbor were closed. And undoubtedly there was some tourism related losses to the local economies there. So just kind of shifting gears a little bit and taking a look at the phytoplankton monitoring data that we collect as part of the ORHAB program. This on the bottom panel there are cell counts of Alexandrium from Long Beach and later in the time series Tokeland. Basically, you can see that we see Alexandrium blooms almost every year, but what we don't see is that toxin in shellfish species. So the yellow dots are mussels. Those are the ones that, as we've heard, most frequently pick up PSP. And then if we look at this highlighted panel of 2024 in the right, we can see that we picked up this bloom late in May on our coastal beaches and saw a subsequent uptake of toxin in shellfish after that. And this data is really important. It helps the Department of Health and the shellfish growers really prioritize sampling to make sure these closures are effective. And it also, almost as importantly, provides a lot of data on bloom termination and when the cells are gone and we can expect fisheries to open back up. So, you know, the number one question we get after a closure is how long are we going to be shut down? Growers in particular need to make business plans around being open or closed, whether they're going to lay off employees or not, right? So I wanted to share a conceptual model of how the phytoplankton monitoring plays into an early warning system. This system's worked well for Washington. There's a lot of nuances to this model, but basically you can see that the routine phytoplankton monitoring feeds into a series of responses based on species present or action levels, and those trigger additional water and shellfish sampling and subsequently management actions to either keep a fishery open or close it. So keeping this model in mind in the next few slides, we're going to see how we can change it and maybe improve it to respond to PSP events and better adapt it for industry concerns as well. One thing I'd like to note is this model relies on having trained staff that are able to efficiently identify and count the growing list of harmful algal species that we're seeing on our coast. And I just want to acknowledge NCOS, Bigelow Labs, and others for their support for staff training for this very specialized skill. So, what we heard from growers and others, as Jerry mentioned, we had a meeting with the shellfish industry, but also from the public as well, is just the need for increased phytoplankton monitoring in Willapa Bay, expanding routine, spatial, and temporal coverage. As you can see on this map on the right, all these red dots are individual shellfish beds or growing operations. So the bay is widely used, and every little piece of data that we can have about these blooms helps keep those fisheries open. So also with this event, we were able to establish new action levels to feed into that conceptual model as well. So we've had a pretty good idea of pseudonychia levels and how that relates to domoic acid uptake. What we didn't have is a real good understanding of Alexandrium cell levels and the subsequent uptake of PSP in shellfish. So we've established these new action levels of 5,000 cells a liter if we see Alexandrium on our outer coastal beaches, and 3,000 cells a liter if we see Alexandrium inside our coastal bays. And then we've also been able to work with a couple of companies to bring rapid field PSP tests specifically suited to the suite of PSP toxins we have in the Pacific Northwest to our lab in Willapa Bay to cut down on some of that analysis time. So out of this event came new tools to track HABs. Parker McCready at the UW was kind enough to put together a model of drifter tracks for Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor. So looking back at the data, we noticed that pretty much every time we've seen PSP and shellfish in Willapa Bay and Grays Harbor, our beach sampling has picked that up. So this is just a new tool that's available online to be able to track where those cells, these two dark dots from our beach monitoring sites, might travel within a 3-day forecast window. So it provides some great information on, are these cells even going to make it into the bay, and then where in the bay they might be heading. We're also interested in using some of the existing platforms that have been brought online recently to collect additional information on Alexandrium and PSP. Right now, these instruments like the Lightfish, ESP Eddy, and some sampling that's occurring on ships of opportunity, crab vessels, and others have done a really good job in capturing data on pseudonychia and domoic acid. But having the opportunity to add information on Alexandrium and PSP to these instruments and different platforms would be another great next step. And then as far as communicating those findings and results, as managers, we rely heavily on the PNW HAB bulletin that Matt talked about a little bit. And currently its primary focus has been on pseudonychia and domoic acid, but there's an opportunity there, we believe, to add some more data and information on Alexandrium and PSP. So lastly, we also heard from industry and others that improved communication would help in these events. So expectations for preseason testing, screening criteria, just general coordination. As Jerry mentioned, it's difficult for people to get samples to the public health lab. And then just the different entities. There's 30 different individual shellfish companies in Willapa Bay alone, and just them being able to coordinate together. Phone tree was what came out of this event that seemed to work well. And then also messaging locally and nationally, and the need for education on these events. And so to that last point, this is my last slide here. Following this PSP event, we had a tripos, an unprecedented bloom of tripos that stained and discolored razor clams and oysters that caused a pretty significant market disruption for growers. With our phytoplankton monitoring data, thankfully, Department of Health was able to provide the industry with a letter to show customers and consumers that these stained shellfish were in fact safe to eat But at the end of the day, you know, the market just really didn't want them. If you had the choice between a stained red oyster or a nice, clean white oyster, people were making the choice for the cleaner oyster. So there was about a 2-week shutdown as companies looked for untainted product to harvest. And the general consensus was that people were really confused with the term red tide in this bloom. So more education on that is definitely needed. And interestingly enough, talking with shellfish growers, this bloom had a greater economic impact than the PSP bloom due to the length of the shutdown. So I'm going to just finish up with that.
Wow, fascinating. Thank you. I want to leave as much time now for Q&A. We have a few questions queued up. Please continue to put those in the question box if you have them. I'll go right ahead, start with Jonathan Avenidas. Thanks, great to see you here. He wants to know, has HPLC been considered for measuring PSTs in Oregon or Washington? What are the barriers preventing the switch to this method for monitoring? And I know that's been addressed a little bit in the last talk or so, so whoever wants to grab it, grab it.
I'll jump in. So HPLC, talking about the Peacocks method, I'm assuming. Our lab's actually looking at that. We have sent staff up to Alaska because that's what Alaska is using right now. Again, this is getting away from using a mouse bioassay with all the problems associated with mice and animal testing. So we're really looking at the options. We got the mouse bioassay we're going to keep, but hopefully using less mice, like I said, for receptor binding assay, which we are investigating with this grant we got, hopefully to replace the mouse bioassay. But we're also going to be looking at the Peacocks, the HPLC method as well, to have multiple options to deal with this in the future to prevent kind of going to prioritization, which is a nightmare. So hopefully that answers some of your question.
Yeah, I think that's great. I'll move on to the next question. So Kurt Carpenter is asking if there were higher water temperatures causing higher feeding rates and then more toxin uptake, do you think?
Yeah, that's a interesting one, but we didn't look at that specifically, but we did notice early on in the year that we were seeing slightly warmer temperatures in our beach monitoring data, and also a decreased salinity, which we think kind of favored dinoflagellates. I don't know about the shellfish feeding. We do know in Willapa Bay and Grace Harbor that it was a big year for summer mortality. So that, you know, that could have been one of the stressors too as well.
Mm-hmm. Any other speculation? So Dan Ayers is also here. He'd like to know if you have any data on PSP levels in razor clam tissue, especially given the high cell counts on Copalis Beach. To the best of his memory, the last time Washington had a PSP-related razor clam recreational closure was in the fall of '92 through the spring of 1993.
I'll jump in. I don't have that handy right quick to point out, but I'll mention with razor clams though, when we test razor clams for biotoxins, we test the meat because that's basically what people eat. But again, if we tested the whole razor clam to include the guts, I imagine we would be seeing much higher levels of toxin. And that may account for the reason why we don't see such high levels in the razor clams. And that is something we're talking here about here at Health, especially when razor clams are harvested for clam bait. They're used the whole animal to include the guts, and if some of that got out of the hands for using for bait, that could be a problem for human consumption. So, but that's probably one of the reasons why we didn't see the higher levels in the razor clams during this event. But we were definitely seeing some toxin. I just don't have those numbers available in front of me.
Anyone else want to talk about this? Okay, I'm not seeing him in jumping. So Ryan McCabe, the developer of the Pacific Northwest Bulletin, has a question. This event had massive economic and human health impacts. He's wondering if there were any confirmed or even suspected impacts to marine mammals or seabirds in the region.
We didn't notice of any in Oregon. Interestingly enough, at the same time, we had a mysterious oil spill going on in Oregon, and I actually think in Washington as well. So a number of animals that were impacted by the oils were also, they were taken and they were analyzed. And I believe they were going to do analysis on all toxins. I'm not sure if PST toxins were going to be included in that, but we didn't have any that were specific, especially large marine mammals, that would have been categorized as being impacted by PST, not to my knowledge.
Very interesting. Since we know we're seeing a lot of larger animals with PSTs up in Saxitoxin, especially up in Alaska. Shannon Murphy from Oweha in California says, you mentioned language barrier was a challenge in communications, including signage. Which languages would have been helpful for translations? Were there several or mostly one or two besides English?
Oh, there were several. I mean, Southeast Asian harvesters were probably the number one. But I mean, you've got numerous dialects in each country. So, you know, you pick one and it's not going to cover all. So there were issues there. Our agency and Department of Ag have made a lot of inroads working with those communities to find out which is the best dialects to use. It comes down to the point where, you know, your signage is only so good, but then you try to get people to go on to our websites or to the websites where there's more translation available. But you still end up with issues, like I mentioned, where you have electronic deserts or individuals don't even have smartphones or computers. It's the term aging of the harvester is for real. I mean, we have a lot of people that are, it doesn't matter what ethnicity you are, they're older and they're still harvesting and they're just not into the technology like a lot of people are. So it makes it very difficult, and I think this really exemplified it when we started seeing that there was a real language issue within these communities, and I think that that's going to improve because we've made some inroads on it, especially with the questionnaire. I think that really kind of gleaned out some information that will be very helpful when another one of these events occurs.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thanks, Matt. Kurt Carpenter is back with a follow-up question. What PST congeners are most prevalent? Do the current ELISA methods cover these? Jerry, you want to jump in?
Sure. So again, every toxic bloom is a little bit different, and there's a regionality component to it. Some of the screening tools that we looked at so far, it doesn't seem like the ELISA maybe is the best tool for this, which is why we're looking at a variety of these screening tools that maybe closer match the profile of congeners that we have here in the Northwest. But, you know, one of the concerns that these are screening tools, and that's why we always go to the gold standard of mouse bioassay and hopefully other methods that will replace that. But when it comes to the screening tools, you know, it is a screen. A lot of people try to get too much out of them. Which is why we need to really look at these. And that's why we reached out to a lot of these folks who are developing these tools to work with us to share our data at the biotoxin lab in Seattle in the public health lab with the mouse bioassay and compare the numbers and really maybe fine tune some of these screening tools to be more applicable for what we have here in the Pacific Northwest. So this is something that's ongoing, and we're having discussions with people and inviting people out to our lab to collaborate with us to maybe provide some of these better tools in the future. So this is ongoing and something that really got a jump start because of this event that happened last year.
Thanks. Ryan has a follow-up. It wants you to look into your crystal ball and think about the fact that Alexandrium cells are continuing to be found at different sites along the coast. So do you have any foresight on whether or not we could end up with another PSP event this year?
I'll jump in real quick and you guys other can follow up, but I'm concerned. Tracy and I are the biotoxin team here in Washington, Tracy Berry, and she lives on the coast and she's been looking in for cells and grabbing more muscle samples because we have been seeing these Alexandrium cells showing up in the last month or so. And we've been seeing some low levels of toxin in our sentinel muscle sites. And we did test some commercial product, which was still no toxin detected, but we're in high surveillance at this point. It is concerning seeing, you know, we see cells like this pretty much every year, but this is kind of a little bit more early, I think, and some of the cell abundances have been slightly higher to what I can recall, and maybe Zach can talk more about it from Washington's perspective here. But definitely that's why we did the cyst survey as well, just to give us another indicator. Is the risk even more elevated? Did we get a big cyst deposit last year? And we're looking forward to getting those results soon and sharing it with everybody on the coast. But yeah, I would say I'm very concerned by what we're seeing, and we're keeping a real close eye on it.
Yeah, I'll echo that concern too. We are seeing some of the higher cell counts that we've experienced this spring reaching those action levels already, right? So in years that we've had closures, we've always seen cells early on and then a spike later in the year. So definitely a concern.
I'll agree.
And we have another one coming in. Mallory Mintz asks, can you speak a little more on your cyst research protocols, time of year of survey, et cetera?
So again, we reached out. We have Cheryl Greengrove at UW helping out and kind of leading this project. She's what helped us in the past in 2014, like I mentioned, when we had another cyst survey with some emergency funds based on what happened in Puget Sound and Hood Canal area. So these sediment samples are collected, and we're working with the shellfish industry as well to identify these sites within these coastal bays, which are shallow. And we try to do this in wintertime when the cysts, should be more easily observed based on what may have happened last year. And these sediment samples are dyed, and these little cysts will glow, and they're observed through a microscope and counted to give you a density of these cysts. Again, this has worked well for us in Puget Sound. Even when years ago we did a major cyst survey throughout Puget Sound, it really matched up very well to where we typically see PSP occur every year, spring, summer, and fall. There were some pretty good cyst beds, and those were our hot spots. They aligned well, and again, so more to come on this one on the coast. But yeah, I think Cheryl was in this audience. She said she was going to participate, listen in on it. I don't know if she's still there or not, but she's a lead on it. She can give you the more specifics. But I'm glad it's behind us now. They got the samples, and they're actually processing them now as we speak, with results hopefully to come out by the end of this month.
Clarissa, you're muted.
Thank you. I was just saying, we're done with the questions that are here. We're past the top of the hour. We're going to conclude, but I wanted to thank you three. It's been incredible. You have a wealth of knowledge on this. This was a really insane event. And I think we have one last slide, Masha, for the future, which is TBD. So if you have thoughts on what you'd like to hear about, please let us know. But we are aiming for a June timeframe for that next webinar, and we do look forward to seeing you all. It's been great attendance, and thank you again for speaking today, Zach, Matt, and Jerry.